They're going to beat that team?
Yes.
Because not to mention, they're not going to guard Rodman, and they're doubling every time. MJ.
Listen, first of all, you got to hit those threes. Okay.
They hit them.
Another question. What era are we playing in? Are we playing in the big boy era where you can knock people on the ass, or are we playing in this little cupcake era now where you can't touch people?
Give me an era. I think they win in both eras.
Will you stop it?
Oh, hold on. Is Clay not tough? Clay couldn't play back then?
Whoever's paying him to say all this stuff, I will pay you double to stop it.
Hold on.
Shaquille O'Neal just went off on LeBron James, and this time he didn't hold anything back. He looked straight into the camera and said what millions of people have been thinking, but nobody dared to say out loud. This wasn't friendly debate. This wasn't TV banter. This was Shaq, a four-time champion, a man who built this league, finally snapping after years of watching LeBron rewrite history in his own favor. And once the clip hit the internet in 2025, the basketball world completely... Let's set the scene. It's 2025, the NBA is in full swing, and the GOAT debate, that exhausting, never-ending argument that basketball fans have been having for the last decade, somehow finds a way to get even louder. LeBron James, as he tends to do, makes a comment. Not a direct statement, not a press conference declaration, just a subtle, well-placed remark, the kind LeBron has mastered over the years, that nudges the conversation exactly where he wants it to go. He implies, without saying it directly, that his body of work deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as Michael Jordan, that his longevity, his championships, his statistical dominance, all of it puts him right there at the top, maybe even above. And for most people in the media, they nod along. They debate it politely. They say things like, well, it's complicated, and both guys have strong cases. But not Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal was sitting on that panel, calm, composed, cracking jokes like he always does, and then something shifted. You could see it in his face. That easy smile disappeared. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward in his chair, looked directly into the camera, and the room went quiet. He said enough was enough. He said the comparisons needed to stop. He said, and this is the part that sent the internet into a complete frenzy, that LeBron has spent so much energy trying to position himself as the greatest that he's lost sight of what actually made Jordan untouchable in the first place. Now let that sink in for a second. This isn't some random sports commentator with a hot take. This is Shaquille O'Neal, a man who played against Jordan, a man who dominated the league for over a decade, a man who has more rings than LeBron and earned every single one of them. When Shaq speaks about basketball greatness, it carries weight that very few people on this planet can match. And he just publicly torched LeBron's GOAT claim in front of millions of people. But here's the thing, if you think this came out of nowhere, you haven't been paying attention, because this tension between Shaq and LeBron, it's been building for a very, very long time.
Players say, including myself, I feared Mike. I've heard players in your generation say they feared Kobe. I've never really heard any players say they fear LeBron.
There have been several times when Shaquille O'Neal has publicly questioned LeBron James's legacy, fear factor, and claim to greatness. For years, Shaq's been dropping blunt truths that the modern media often avoids, and every time he speaks, it sends ripples through the basketball world. What he's revealed has made fans rethink what real dominance looks like in today's game. This isn't about hating on LeBron.
Here's what the media doesn't want to talk about. Shaq and LeBron have never truly been close. And anyone who's followed both careers closely already knows this. The smiles at all-star games, the friendly interviews, the mutual compliments tossed around on television, a lot of that has always been surface level, performative, the kind of professionalism you maintain when cameras are rolling and brands are watching. But behind the scenes, the friction has always been there. Think back to the early years of LeBron's career. LeBron came into the league at 18 years old, and the media immediately started doing what the media does. They started projecting. They called him the chosen one before he'd played a single professional minute. They said he was going to change everything. They said he was going to be the greatest player who ever lived. And Shaq, who was at the absolute peak of his powers at that time, who had just won back-to-back championships, who was the most dominant force in the sport, watched all of this happen. He didn't say much publicly, but people close to him say he noticed. He always noticed. As LeBron's career grew, so did the comparisons. First, it was LeBron versus Kobe. Then, as the championships started stacking up, the conversation shifted. Jordan entered the picture, and quietly, subtly, Shaq got pushed further and further out of the GOAT conversation entirely, as if his era, his dominance, his titles somehow didn't count the same way anymore. Think about how that feels for a second. You are one of the most physically gifted athletes in the history of human sport. You changed the way the center position was played forever. You won 4 championships. You were Finals MVP 3 times. And then one day you turn on the television and the entire conversation has moved on. And the new narrative is that greatness only started when LeBron laced up his sneakers. That would bother anyone. And Shaq is not just anyone. There were small moments over the years, comments that got brushed off as jokes but landed a little too sharp to really be jokes. Questions about leadership, questions about whether LeBron truly elevates his teammates or whether he needs a perfect situation around him to succeed. Questions about the mental toughness required to win a championship versus the organizational genius required to put yourself in a position to win one. None of it was explosive, none of it made headlines the way 2025 did, but it was always there. And in 2025, the lid finally blew off. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because the 2025 version of the Jordan versus LeBron debate isn't just about basketball anymore. It hasn't been for a while. It's become cultural. It's about identity, loyalty, generational pride. If you grew up watching Jordan, crowning LeBron feels like a betrayal of your childhood. And if LeBron is your guy, if he's the reason you fell in love with basketball, then any suggestion that he falls short of Jordan feels like a personal attack. Shaq understands all of this. He's been in media long enough to know how these conversations work, which is exactly why his 2025 outburst hit so differently. He didn't approach it like a debate, he approached it like a verdict. He pointed to something that gets overlooked in these conversations constantly, the circumstances. Jordan played in an era where you either won or you went home. There were no super teams. There was no gathering of top 5 players onto a single roster to guarantee yourself a path to the finals. You went to war with your team, you found a way to make it work, and you won or you didn't. Jordan won 6 times with the same franchise without ever switching teams to chase a ring. Shaq brought all of this up, and he did it without flinching. He acknowledged LeBron's greatness. He's not blind. Nobody's serious as saying LeBron isn't an all-time player. But he drew a clear line, a line between being great and being the greatest. And he planted Jordan firmly on one side of that line and suggested LeBron was still standing on the wrong side of it. The clip spread everywhere within hours. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, every basketball account on the internet had something to say. The comment sections turned into full-scale wars. LeBron fans came in with statistics, points, assists, longevity, all of it. Jordan fans came back with rings, with finals records, with the 6-0, and everybody in the middle just watched the whole thing burn. But here's what nobody was talking about in those comment sections. What was Shaq's real motivation? Because people who have been around the NBA for decades say this wasn't just about Jordan versus LeBron. This was about respect, about Shaq feeling like his own era, his own greatness gets disrespected every single time the GOAT conversation happens without including his name seriously. And honestly, he might have a point. Now, let's talk about LeBron's response, because this is where it gets subtle, and LeBron James has always been a master of subtle. He didn't call a press conference, he didn't go on television and address Shaq directly. That's not how LeBron operates. Anyone who has watched him navigate controversy over the years knows that LeBron responds in layers. He lets his camp react first. He lets the internet do half the work. And then, at exactly the right moment, he says just enough to make his position crystal clear without ever looking like he's rattled. People close to the situation say LeBron was aware of Shaq's comments within minutes of them going public. In his reaction, according to insiders, and keep in mind, this is the stuff that isn't all over the media yet, was not surprise. It was quiet frustration. The kind of frustration that comes not from being caught off guard, but from watching someone you've tried to respect publicly undermine you in a way that you know is going to follow you for months. His inner circle pushed back first. Social media posts, retweets, subtle references to legacy statistics that happen to favor LeBron, all carefully coordinated, all designed to let the numbers speak while LeBron himself stayed above the noise. But then LeBron spoke, not about Shaq directly, not by name, but in a 2025 media session, casual, relaxed, like he was talking about the weather. LeBron said something that everyone in that room understood was a direct response. He talked about longevity. He talked about what it means to still be performing at the highest level after 2 decades in the league. He talked about the evolution of the game and how greatness in one era can't simply be copy-pasted onto another era and called superior. And then he smiled that smile, that LeBron smile that somehow says everything and nothing at the same time. The internet went absolutely nuclear. Because now both sides had ammunition. Shaq had drawn the line. LeBron had stepped right up to it and stared across without blinking. And millions of basketball fans were caught in the middle watching two of the biggest personalities in the history of the sport go at each other in the most controlled, calculated, devastating way possible. But here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. Is this really just about basketball, or is this something deeper, something more personal, something that has been festering between these two men for longer than any of us realized? Stay with me, because the next part is where it gets really interesting. When Shaq speaks, the basketball world listens. And in 2025, after his comments about LeBron exploded across every platform, the entire NBA community was forced to pick a lane. Former players came out of the woodwork. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly had opinions. People who had always carefully stayed neutral suddenly found themselves being dragged into the debate whether they wanted to be or not. Some backed Shaq completely. They echoed his point about era, about circumstances, about the difference between manufacturing greatness and just having it. They talked about what it took to compete in the NBA during the Jordan years, the physicality, the lack of rules protecting offensive players, the sheer brutality of the game at that time. They said modern basketball has softened in ways that make raw statistical comparisons between eras essentially meaningless. Others backed LeBron. They talked about adaptability. They talked about how true greatness isn't limited by era, that a player who is genuinely the best will find a way to be the best regardless of when they play. They talked about LeBron's basketball IQ, his playmaking, his ability to elevate entire franchises rather than just individual games. And then there were the fans. Oh, the fans. Social media in 2025 turned into an absolute war zone over this. And what was fascinating, genuinely fascinating, was watching how personal it got. People weren't just defending basketball players. They were defending their entire relationship with the sport, defending the era they grew up in, defending the version of basketball that first made them fall in love with the game. LeBron fans were furious. They felt like Shaq was using his platform to punch down at a player who has consistently shown him respect over the years. They pointed to every moment LeBron had praised Shaq publicly and said, "This is how you repay that? On a panel in front of millions of people, you use your platform to tear him down?" Shaq supporters pushed back just as hard. They said this isn't tearing someone down, this is honesty. This is someone with real credentials telling real truths that everyone else is too scared to say because LeBron's brand is too powerful, his fan base is too loud, and the media is too invested in the narrative they've been selling for the last decade. And here's the thing, both sides had a point. That's what made it so explosive. This wasn't a clear-cut good guy versus bad guy situation. This was two legitimate perspectives, backed by real emotion, real experience, real history, colliding at full speed in the middle of the most passionate sports debate of our generation. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the actual basketball, the art of the game, the beauty of watching two all-time greats operate at the peak of human performance got completely buried under the noise, which, if you think about it, might be the saddest part of this entire story. Chapter 6. What this really means for LeBron's legacy. Let's be real for a second. Because underneath all the noise, underneath the Twitter wars and the panel debates and the hot takes that will be forgotten in 3 weeks, there is a real and serious question at the center of all of this. What does LeBron's legacy actually look like when the dust settles? And more specifically, does Shaq's criticism, as personal and pointed as it was, actually damage it? Here's the honest answer. No, not directly. LeBron's statistics are not going anywhere. The championships are not going anywhere. The longevity, the absolutely absurd, almost biologically impossible longevity of his career is not going anywhere. Those facts are permanent. But legacy isn't just facts. Legacy is the story people tell you after you're done. It's the version of your career that gets passed down to the next generation, the highlights that get played, the comparisons that get made, the adjectives that get attached to your name in sentences about the history of the sport. And that part, the storytelling part, is absolutely affected by moments like this. Because every time a figure with Shaq's credibility stands up and draws a clear line between LeBron and the true pinnacle of basketball greatness, it plants a seed. Maybe not in the hardcore fans who have already made up their minds, but in the casual viewer, in the next generation of fans who are still forming their opinions, in the sports historians who are 10 years away from writing the definitive accounts of this era. Shaq just made their job harder for the LeBron side. And LeBron knows that, which is why, despite that calm smile, despite the carefully measured response, despite every piece of controlled public behavior, this one got under his skin in a way that most criticism simply doesn't. Because Shaq isn't a hater. He's not a troll with a Twitter account. He's not a bitter former player with no credibility. He is one of the most decorated, respected, physically dominant players in the history of the sport. And when he says the comparisons to Jordan need to stop, people listen. Not because he's necessarily right, but because he has earned the right to be heard. And that's the part that LeBron, for all his genius, for all his control over his own narrative, he simply cannot argue away with statistics. So, here's where we land. Shaquille O'Neal went off on LeBron James in 2025 in a way that nobody expected, using language that cut through all the polished media narratives and landed like a punch straight to the center of the biggest basketball debate in history. LeBron responded, carefully, precisely, in that way only LeBron knows. The world took sides, the debate exploded, and the question that has defined an entire generation of basketball fans, Jordan or LeBron, got louder and messier and more emotional than ever before. But here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to think about this seriously before you go down to the comments. If Michael Jordan himself, not Shaq, not a media personality, not a former player, if Jordan came out tomorrow and said LeBron James is not the greatest player who ever lived, would that finally settle the debate, or would LeBron's fan base find a way to argue against even that? Drop your answer below. I want to know exactly where you stand on this. And if you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of basketball fan this channel was built for. Hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week, we bring you the stories, the drama, and the real conversations that the mainstream media glosses over. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Subscribe, it's free, and the next one is going to be even bigger.